Hi, I'm Roger Aguinaldo, and welcome to the M&A Advisor podcast. Since 1998, the M&A Advisor has been the definitive source dedicated to recognizing achievement, delivering unrivaled thought leadership, and connecting the world's mergers and acquisitions elite. We help you sharpen your edge and accelerate your success in deal making. Whether you're an ambitious new player or a market veteran, this podcast provides masterclass strategies, unvarnished stories, and vital lessons from the industry's influential figures. Before we launch into this episode, be sure to follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and subscribe to our essential M&A Alerts email newsletter. Find all the links below. Your engagement fuels the deal-making community. Now let's get into the transaction.
Roger, thank you. And Roger, thanks for the efforts of putting all this together. It's appreciated.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So I can talk a lot about myself, but the esteemed panel that we have here is awesome, and they do wonderful work. We work with them quite a bit, everybody here. We're going to talk about selling a distressed business, one that's typically, Mike and I, when we walk into a situation, usually there's a panic. Many of you know this, just to set the stage for the conversation. There's a panic. People don't really have a good sense of where cash is running. People don't have a good sense of fiduciary duties. And the way our process works is typically, Rob, you're usually the first guy on the scene, trying to tell boards of directors and management teams, here's what your responsibilities are. So when you're involved in something like that and you realize that it's time to get a financial advisor or CRO involved in a situation, how do you navigate that and convince everybody? Because first question, how much is it going to cost? They're kind of scared, they're nervous. How do you think about that?
Better?
Yeah, I think that's
Better, okay. Well, we could be in as company counsel from the beginning, where we're trying to stay ahead of the iceberg and let them know, what are your issues? It's all about liquidity. And some clients are great and they actually have a clue what they're doing when they're managing their cash. And others have no idea. So we were involved in a matter with you where your team dropped in and you were able to understand the cash management very quickly, and that gave us plenty of time to bring in a banker and run a process. But typically, right, it could be Brian as the private equity, where they've already worked through figuring out where they are directionally on value and liquidity with their lenders. And so counsel will be brought in to help advise the company. And the first thing we'll say is, let's get someone independent, talking about a privately owned company, because they often have people on the board, so we want to protect everybody. And we'll start with, let's bring in someone independent. And that's probably going to be a discussion not just with my owners, but with the lenders, because the lenders are driving the bus in virtually all of these. It's not like there's value in excess of the secured debt anymore, right? And so the discussion is, it's a multi-party discussion about bringing people in, because my private equity owners, they've already decided, for the most part, they understand it's safer not to be involved in the ongoing decision-making and operation. The lenders are sitting there saying, I want you to pick from my list of 2. You've got management who doesn't understand what they're doing. So when we talk to them about trying to navigate the difficulties, the actual management, they're thinking, if I let you bring in Mike and Sandeep, I'm done. I have no job. They're totally displacing me. And how do I have a role? Am I basically just being zeroed out? So there's psychology involved, right? There's trying to explain, here's how you can be helpful, right? We're going to let them sort of run the business, but we're going to bring you in to help manage the process. The process is going to be dealing with my equity, dealing with my lenders. we're going to, besides bringing in an independent director, we're going to want to bring in bankers, because then we can bring the bankers in to help assess all the different ways we should be thinking about maximizing the value, and they can make recommendations to everyone. And so we're going to introduce you as someone who can come in and help manage cash, maybe see some things they haven't seen in terms of making changes to improve cash, to deal with vendors, because a lot of times they're already stretching vendors and they don't have that expertise. And then your ability to interact with Jeff and his team, because they know what they're looking for in the way of information and a package. So there's psychology involved. There's, and that's just a multi-party discussion trying to bring someone in. And look, there are instances where people don't want to bring in a CRO because they think it's too expensive or it displaces me as management. And then we have our investment bankers, and it can be a little bit more cumbersome and time consuming because people may not know exactly what it is we need to deliver to deal with the banking and the lenders.
So thanks, Rob. That all makes sense. So, Mike, Rob hits on a really important point about the psychology of a deal. You get parachuted in. Now Rob's done his job to at least lay the tracks for you to have an entry point as the CRO or FA. What are you doing to say, hey, listen, I'm not your enemy, I'm your friend?
Well, I think Rob highlighted at the beginning that it all starts with liquidity. That really sets the stage for the reality for the company, the conversation, the timeline, and the initiatives you're going to have to go through. So it starts with liquidity, but then quickly pivots to trying to understand what the underlying business is. A lot of times management teams are very proud of their business. The situation that they're in currently may not reflect the value. If you're going down a sales process, you want to try to maximize value. So sometimes it's an opportunity to bring the company along on a journey and initiate the change that they've been looking to do to extract that value. That happened on the case that Rob and I were on. We looked at this company and the underlying value was the footprint and the assets. And so instead of focusing necessarily on P&L, profitability, EBITDA, we looked at how can we make these assets show the best during a sales process. And we'd reach out to someone like Jeff to say, this is what we're thinking about. And in that matter, we actually shrunk the customer base by 90%, shrunk it down to the customers that represent the top 2/3 of the business. And that allowed us to, one, actually maximize liquidity by simplifying the vendor base. But more importantly, it got all of the equipment up and running at the industry standards. We were doing longer runs, less turnover, less product change out. And so as it came time to do the actual due diligence about 2 months down the road, when we were doing management visits, the assets highlighted better. So it's about finding out what the real value of that business is, getting in conversations with folks like Jeff early on, starting to share that strategy, and setting yourself up for when you get into due diligence, getting ahead of the questions and allowing the asset to show as best as it can.
But Mike, you had to shrink the customer base by 90%. What's the psychology that goes into convincing the management team that that's the right thing to do? And you're, on one hand, trying to preserve liquidity and create runway, but on the other hand, Jeff's going to say, well, wait a minute, I got to market this asset.
Yeah, it's a complicated conversation, but again, driven by liquidity, looking at where we were at in terms of being able to get supply in, working on getting additional financing in. We looked at the realities of our liquidity. We also, spoke to the investment bankers early on and understood who the likely pool of buyers would be for this asset, what their perspective on the asset would be, which customers in our portfolio would extract the most value and which they would likely pivot away from. And then conversations with our investment bankers and our management team, we were able to settle on a strategy that allowed us to extend the liquidity runway, maximize the customer base that was there, and then obviously the buyers that we thought would be there at the finish line were there. And then the best part about it was the discontinued customers, we got them to take their last and final payment of buying all of their inventory on hand, paying off all their AR, and paying COD. So even by firing 90% of the customers, we got them to fund an extra 30 days of the sale process.
I mean, I think one of the things that highlights is that these processes are not linear, that they're sort of, I'll call them multifaceted, and we talk about sort of a three-dimensional chessboard, all the things that lots of us in this business talk about, but there's not necessarily one path from A to B. And figuring out what those different things are you can do along the way, like you say, shrink in order to create value, eliminate 90% of your business to sort of find sort of that there's a diamond inside that lump of coal. There's something in there. And I mean, that's where the real value add comes in the kinds of processes that we all find ourselves in. And that oftentimes the reflexive answer of companies in default, let's go find a buyer, actually may not be the right answer. And sometimes the parties on the other side of the table, oftentimes the lenders, need to be educated on why doing that might actually not be in their best interest. Because to your point, Rob, the idea that there's value that breaks below the secured debt these days is a pretty unlikely scenario, just given how levered lots of companies are. And so part of it is educating the lenders that might not actually be the best answer for them, putting aside everybody else.
Well, this specific example, though, they had already undertaken 2 restructurings, right? You guys were brought in, and then the company was still doing poorly. So when we talk about the psychology, there are different people we're talking about, right? So, but by the end, the equity, Brian had already negotiated the surrender with the lenders, and an independent was brought in, right, because the equity was walking away. And management had been there for they've been there for years, right? So they're proud of it and all of their customers. But once it really hit, right, and the equity was basically walking away, management psychology also had to change, right? And so I think they were much more receptive to the operating suggestions of less may be materially more, right? Because they were trying to grow instead of actually focusing on where the real value would be. So in our particular case, they've been through a couple, and then once equity walked away, I think that helped with your psychology with the management team.
No, it's a really good point, but you actually remind me of something that is a current dynamic I think we're all facing, because we all hear about LMEs, we talk about restructurings. I mean, Rob, they restructured 2 times, now they're on their 3rd. Why didn't it work?
Well, I think because
I'm going to ask Brian the same question in a second here.
Well, look, I mean, there are different goals as well. I mean, we were talking earlier about Brian's goal with the equity hat versus my lender's goal of sort of a shorter term horizon. I think if you had really good management who could see past their own thinking to where you guys came in and said, no, wait, let's focus on, we have 3 plants, here's our location, 3 plants. We were lucky, right? Tariffs were just introduced, making our domestic operations much more appealing, right? Because we had strategics interested who were purchasing and manufacturing outside the state. So we did have some pretty good luck with the ultimate outcome. And the ultimate outcome paid off the banks. And the equity had a B piece that was hanging around, and they picked up a couple $1 million because of the process. So things hit really well. I think that they just didn't have a very good way of managing their raw materials and their cash. And I think that's where you guys came in and said, well, wait, there are ways we can do this that will give you more runway and actually help you.
That makes sense. So Mike, I'm going to ask you the same question. This thing went through, we took it through the 3rd restructuring, right? If you had been there in the 1st or maybe the 2nd, how would we have left it, or how would you have left it?
I think
this is an important point, because there's a lot going on right now where people mess with the balance sheet, but they don't think about the P&L and liquidity.
I think the issue that this particular company had was that they were logo chasing on the sales front. So, it's a paper manufacturing company. it's pretty obvious that long run times is the path to success. They were chasing all these small, high-end name brand logos, growing revenue in little bites and chunks, when in reality they should have simplified down to a smaller customer base that could be run more operationally. One of the key indicators we had was contribution margin, gross margin. Those were not KPIs that were anywhere in the company's deck. It was all a sales-driven KPI strategy. And I think that there were several opportunities, as Rob mentioned, to take that pivot. But again, the overall arching thing was, can we grow this thing to X million dollars of revenue with no discussion to the underlying profitability associated with that?
So that you can exit.
Correct. And I think, for us, the decision tree is a little bit different. But the important part when you make the decision not to cut additional checks, right? At the point when we're having liquidity issues, we can't or won't cut additional equity checks. That's when you have to put on the fiduciary duty hat and realize quickly we educate our team on what is the fiduciary duty, what's our job as a board. It's not just to maximize equity value for our investors any longer. It's about the employees and the people. And so I've seen situations when I was at a larger firm where we hired an army of advisors and the company and the management team is getting advice from 17 different people all at the same time with 15 different ideas on cutting SKUs and the equity's still around. And I think when it works well, it's when you get the right advisors that do have some expertise that can really help plug those holes. And it's one of the few times you'll find private equity people taking advice, right? We usually have all the answers until we don't. And certain private equity folks have more or less experience in restructuring. For better or for worse, I was a restructuring person sometimes, so I know enough to be dangerous. But it's time when we need advice from the right advisors. And so I think it's critical for us at that time to do the right interviews, find the right people to partner with to help the company, because that management team, usually you've kind of got a mix of a management team that's been there forever and another management team that's been brought in to try to get you to the next level or fix that liquidity problem or a new CFO. And so those people have been fighting fires, so it's important to help them have another future with the next investor, whoever that may be. And it's important for us to understand the fiduciary duty we have as board of directors, and that's when we do hire you guys, bring you in. We need independence, we need to take advice, we need to educate the management team that hopefully hasn't been around this kind of mess before. And so that's really critical to us to find the right folks.
So I'd like to ask you a question. I know you're the moderator,
No,
but
that's
I'd
okay.
like to ask you a
Please,
question.
please.
So oftentimes in the roles that we all play as advisors, as you say, private equity is sort of omnipotent. You know everything. And so given that that's the case, when a process starts out, do you have a sort of a predetermined view as to how you think things are going to go or how you want them to go? And then you're soliciting input to sort of validate that, to test that, or to disprove that? Maybe share a little bit of how private equity, when you're sitting in that seat, you're thinking about that sort of evolution of a process.
Sure, and I think it's a great question, which is, your first question is, what other levels are there to pull, right? What other things can we do that are maybe non-traditional? Have we looked at the cash flows? Have we looked at alternative lending sources? What sort of things can we find? And I think at that point, we continue to try to pull alternatives. And so we have a view, we have some experience, but not that you guys have. And so it's important to bring the advisors in to really understand, what is your view? Where can you maximize value? The problem we have is, in some ways, we're kind of like management, right? We've been in the company for 4 or 5 years, hopefully. We love it. We've really built a culture with the team. And so we may not see some things that are sitting right in front of us, like a SKU analysis or some of the products or customers. And so having that fresh view and kind of being on your heels or in that situation where you didn't make a good investment and you didn't make good decisions and things didn't go your way, it's important to listen at that point. And so it's critical, I think, to find the right folks.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, Brian, because to build on Jeff's question, because this is one of the things that we observe when we parachute in. You've got a management team that's been there they're endeared to you, you're endeared to them, right? Now you got to tell them, or at least convey to them, hey, I don't have any more money. And usually management will say, look, give me another $10 million, another 18 months, and I can fix it. But you've already given them $10 million and you've given them 48 months and they haven't fixed it. So how do you manage the management team and the messaging? Because it goes into Rob's point about psychology. I mean, that's all part of it.
No, I think you nailed it. And I think far too often we're not transparent enough as private equity folks. And so having the transparent dialogue to see the train coming, what you don't want to do is call them up one day and say, hey, we re-underwrote this business and we're not cutting another $10 million check. But if you're really close with the management team and you have an actual relationship, they're going to see the train coming. You're going to have discussions. It's very transparent and open, so that when you get to that point, you say, look, here we are, and this is the time when I get off and another guy gets on or gal gets on. But it's important to have transparency. I know everyone uses that word a lot, but I would say we don't usually practice it as much as we should. And I think when you have that transparency and the link with management, then we can bring in some new folks that are welcomed instead of sometimes people aren't excited to see CROs walk in the door.
Do you wait? I mean, we're talking about management and like, do you wait until you're in default and you're working on your first forbearance? Or are you more interested or inclined to bring people in to help figure out whether you should put the next round of money in as debt or equity? Like when like you asked me, you know, I'm there, right? But I may not be there because Brian, like they're running it on their own. They have they have their operating partners. It's all good until it's not. And we're generally not there day to day. It's usually like, oh crap, we have payroll, or we have these issues where we're in default now. So do you bring people in earlier, or is it really you're waiting?
Well, and I'd say the royal we or the royal you is different than New Water Capital, partially because we've had a lot of that experience. I would never bring someone in on a first default on any loan in the world unless it was just a cratering business, because we do that all the time. It's to negotiate with the lenders. That relationship with the lenders is critical as well. And we have a deal now that's an automotive. Automotive has been up and down for years. We've owned it for 8 years. Great relationship with the folks at PNC actually that work through a lot of ups and downs with strikes and chip shortages and things like that. But on the first default, heck no, unless it's something terrible. I think where you have to be able to call that ball, but I think there is a difference between people who've been raised in restructuring in places like Sun Capital and debt restructuring and your regular way private equity folks. I think those folks probably would benefit from more advice because they haven't seen. I had a deal at Sun Capital. We had 19 different amendments. I did 19 amendments in one deal, and we got out. But it was a little bit special because it was Sun Capital and we lived in that world every day. I think other private equity folks probably would be beneficial, but I will say there's always going to be reluctance to bring someone in because of the thought that when someone does come in, you know you're going down a different path.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's tough. I mean, it's a tough situation. So let's flip this a little bit. Jeff, you know, we've got a situation, we've kind of got it stabilized. Think we've defined a path, not sure. We're going to call you and say, hey, Jeff, can you look at this business and tell us what the possibilities are? How do you go about diligencing that and get excited about it? Because I'm sure you don't say yes to everything that gets thrown in front of you.
We don't. And part of that is, as you say, we wanted diligence up front for a couple reasons. One, trying in a relatively limited period of time, because typically we get the call from private equity sponsor, counsel, an FA, CRO, with the message that we've got to hire a banker. The lenders are either requiring it as a terms of a forbearance agreement. We've got a milestone we got to meet. Sometimes the sponsor will be proactive and they'll say, we know what's coming. We want to bring a banker on board so we can deliver a positive message to the bank. But typically we don't have a whole lot of time to get our arms around a business. And there's typically not a ton of information that we would typically want to have available to us to make a fully informed decision. So part of it is going off of the limited information we have and trying to be as best informed we can to assess, is there something there? Is there something that's saleable? We had a conversation with a very well-known fund last Friday, and we actually declined the opportunity to get engaged because it was a company that had been sold and the company had experienced some difficulties. The company had brought in an FA who was doing great work. Our assessment was the amount of money that would need to be put into the business to turn the business around, that the investment of that new money is probably the money that could be returned in a subsequent sale, and that it was uncertain as to, one, in our view, whether that turn would work, and if so, what the result would be. It wouldn't get any of the existing money back. So we do decline situations, but once we get enough information about a business, it's really trying to understand, right, what is the path forward for that company? Is it going to be a sale process? Is it going to be, and sometimes we find this now more often than not, is it something other than a sale process? Is the sponsor interested in rebuying the equity? We know we talk about sometimes new value plans, But oftentimes we'll find situations where a sponsor says, look, I like the business, I want to still own the business, but I'm not going to be prepared to own that business if you're going to the lenders, if you're going to make me go sell it, because if I expose this to the market, all the customers and all the vendors are going to know what the financial situation is of this company, and I don't want that to happen. So part of it is figuring out, is there something to sell, or is there a transaction that could be had? And if so, what does that look like? And making sure that we have, as part of the tools in our toolkit, the ability to explore and exploit all those different options to create value, so that we can report back to the board or the CRO or independent director, whoever our ultimate client is, what we think those paths are. Because I think that ends up being really important, because it's not just a binary answer. Is it an M&A process or not? And I think that ends up being really important.
Yeah, that's super helpful, because I think for us, at least I'll speak for myself, I think oftentimes we say, hey, get a banker involved, you say yes to everything, and the more I've gotten to work with yourself and others, I think people are becoming a little bit more discriminate about what they choose to get involved with.
They are. I think that's right, and I think that part of that is driven by I'll call it, the number of bites at the apple that parties are able to have before calling us, before deciding whether or not there's going to be a sale process. And sometimes the company, through no fault of anybody's, it hasn't been able to fix itself. And if that's the case, then there may not be anything left for us to really do. And in our view, sometimes it's better to sort of call the ball early and sort of offer that perspective than sort of take on something, run a process for several months, and come back with an answer that nobody's happy with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Brian, now I'm going to flip it a little bit. And now three amigos got together. They made a business ready for sale. It's positioned for its next investor. Distressed, it's got some hair on it. Is that something that you look at? And if so, what are you looking for?
Yeah, absolutely something we look at. I think for us, we're looking for something where there's a really sound business at its core. You've got a reason to exist. Probably some exogenous factors, whether it's a broken balance sheet and some sort of liability that can't get out of, where you see that it's a sound business, where we see potential. And the process of bankruptcy at times, or an out of court, could actually resolve some of the issues the company has, and so we can see a clear path forward. You also end up sometimes with just tired equity, and you just need something fresh, and tired lenders where everyone just doesn't want to deal with it any longer. And so for us, we look at a situation again where you've got a sound business that's been able to preserve enterprise value during. I think some of the concerns we have are, you find a business that files, it goes through a longer process, lots of advisors are hired, liquidity's tight, customers are cut by 90%, sometimes makes sense. So for us, I think it's making sure enterprise value is maintained during that process, and sometimes with competing interests with different lenders and different pieces of the cap structure, right? Liquidity matters more or less. And so again, just enterprise value preservation for us, and really having a clear path with the business once it's cleaned up some of those liabilities.
So are you more likely to be a buyer before there's ever a bankruptcy and before the teams of professionals are brought in, or on the back end?
I'd say we'd prefer it, but probably less likely. Because of all the constituents would have to agree outside of hiring advisors and process. We've tried several times approaching lenders that we know well and said, hey, we've heard this business is in trouble, we're in the industry, we're fresh equity, we're willing to cut a check. Can you talk to us? But then you've still got private equity involved, you've got other lenders involved. Without professionals being brought in, even out of court, we're very limited in what we can do, whether we have relationships or not. And so we'd prefer it, but it probably doesn't happen often without the advisors being brought in and driving a process.
Will you buy the debt so you can drive the process?
We would like to. We've done it in the past. I'd say did it at Sun when we had billions and billions of dollars as a smaller PE firm. It depends, but we certainly would if we could partner with the secured lenders. If we saw there was an ability to credit bid something, absolutely would play that game if we could. But the situation's got to be right, and then it goes back to, is the business sound? We looked at a few of the last 2 years where we just couldn't quite get there on the business piece, even though the cap structure kind of could place for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. So last question, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. You got a distressed business, it's been underperforming. Does it matter whether it goes through a Chapter 11, or do you get comfortable with an Article 9 or maybe a receivership transaction, something that's a little bit more efficient? And I ask that because a lot of what we're seeing now is a pushback on Chapter 11 processes for obvious reasons. They're expensive, they're a little bit unpredictable, not to say other processes aren't. What kind of wrapper are you looking for if you're going to buy an asset?
No, I agree with you. I think Chapter 11 is probably the worst outcome when we're looking as a buyer, because it allows the company to stay in longer and burn more cash and have that uncertainty with management, employees, and everything else. Outside of a process, we absolutely do Article 9s or certain foreclosures. 363 is nice if you can be a stalking horse and set a timetable that makes sense for the company to get adequate bids, but to get out quickly. For us, it's important to have a really good plan before you go in if you have to go in, but our preference would be not to for the costs, as you mentioned.
The panel is running the business while selling it, and we talked about liquidity. And so when I'm thinking about out-of-court transactions, right, the first thing people call, oh my God, payroll, right? So already you have liquidity issues, and where are we with payables? And I think a lot of that may impact whether you have to go in or not, right? It's cheaper, it can be cheaper to stay out of bankruptcy because of all the professional fees, right? But if I'm going to do an out-of-court transaction, I've got payables. I have contract counterparties. What is the asset? What is the business? What can I do? How can I transact? Are you going to do a stock deal out of court, right? Yeah. I mean, so you're saying you don't want to be in bankruptcy, but you're going to do a stock deal. And doesn't that mean if you're the lender, so I have this with several of these deals out of court, it's like, well, I'm owed $250. Jeff's going to run a process, and maybe I'm going to pick up $125 million. And I have all of these other liabilities junior to me, and maybe some seller notes, right? I don't want to do it where I lose value. So I think that impacts the out-of-court versus in-court, right? Net to the house. And what I have to fund, either my lenders or a buyer basically by assuming it in order to transact out of court.
I mean, that's part of the calculus, right, that we're all doing on our side as advisors and your side as the buyer, which is, what is it going to cost for the company to go through a process? What liabilities can I shed? What level of confidence do I get in an 11 that I'm buying free and clear of leases or other liabilities that might drag along if I don't do it through an 11? In contrast, if I can get something done out of court that's not in the public eye, where the transaction can be couched as a sale as opposed to a bankruptcy, and it makes it easier for customers, vendors, suppliers, employees to feel good about the outcome. There's the economic and the non-economic cost that you guys are putting together, Mike and Sandeep, you guys are doing, that we're doing as the banker, looking at what those different options are, whether we've got a buyer that's prepared to transact in or outside of court. And then, Rob, you're coming in and saying, here are the liabilities that are either going to run with the business or that you can leave behind, and that factors into whether or not the transaction is going to be better or worse for the lenders or whoever the fulcrum is.
And a lot of times, I mean, back to operating issues and working with all of you, what kind of business? Are there a lot of contracts? These are all change of control transactions. So if there are really important contracts, do you know they're going to follow? How do I structure it so that you can transact out of court and you're going to be comfortable these 5 important contracts are not going to terminate?
And I think we always look at what levers can you pull, right? If you can designate some leases, if you've got a heavy footprint, you're not sure what you want to do with the business, that's always a nice net benefit of a bankruptcy. If you can shed a really massive liability, or again, it's complex, you're never going to figure it out outside of court without the right advisors. But we do that calculus to say, is it better to go in or not? And then if it's not, we figure it out with the company itself if that opportunity exists.
That all makes sense. Thanks, everybody. I'll open up to questions in the audience if anyone's got any. And I know we didn't cover, I'm sure there's a question or two. We didn't cover every topic or thought.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a mic for you. If you raise your hand, I'll come to you. Any questions?
So let's talk about management. To have the same management stay there, it's kind of doing the same thing and expecting different result. And I know the playbook of any good CRO or FA is to be management friendly, because they're ultimately to replace them in the long run. But what are your thoughts on the fact that management is not a bystander? Management was there when the company underperformed. It was there when liquidity was mismanaged. It was there when the terms got out of hand. It was there ultimately when the capital structure was put in place. And that capital structure wasn't imposed to them, well, unless it's an LBO and they kind of stepped into it, they should have known. So what are your thoughts on that?
You want to take it? You want me to take it? Mike? You want me to do it? Look, when it comes to incumbent management teams, it's a very delicate question, as we've talked about. But for me personally, the way I quickly assess it, and this is within the first week, first of all, we talk to them. We don't make any assumptions about, we've been in that industry, we understand that business, we understand that footprint. We don't know anything. We have some sense, but we don't. And it just depends on how they say what they say, right? If their general attitude is to be defensive, I get insecure. That everyone's going to be scared. No problem with that. But if they're generally defensive and they sort of say, hey, listen, I need a little bit more time, you ask, well, how much time have you been given? You figure that out very quickly too. And we know because we've already spoken to the board or the lenders or the lawyers, somebody's like given us some background on the situation. If they're speaking, I'll use the word humility, they're a little bit self-deprecating, you give them a chance. If they're not, and they're kind of like, they're digging in their heels, then you need to make a change there.
So the way I think about it, sometimes management will say, yeah, this is not a surprise. We've been telling the PE firm, right, here's what we should be doing, right? I'm not that smart, so I know I'm not the smartest. So I want to know as much as I can before I start thinking about steps. So I want to hear from the management team, right? All right, we're here, right? It's the Grim Reaper. Why are we here? What are things that you guys see? And you might hear that, hey, we've been telling them, right, we needed more liquidity, right? They've been starving us. If only I had this, or I would have made these changes. I want to hear all of that. It doesn't mean we're going to jettison management. We all know why we're here, but I think it's helpful to hear what they think brought everyone together, and then we can assess, do I need them? Is this guy really important to get this customer to travel with him as a buyer? Do I need these guys because they hold licenses? Depends on the type of company, founders. So I don't know that you just get rid of them right away. I think you have to figure out what their role has been.
No, that makes a lot of sense. But one of the common things, I'll give you an answer. One of the things that we see a lot of now is everyone wants to work remotely. If a management team says, yeah, we're working remotely and this business is distressed and there's no there, we can all meet, the management team's not meeting, it's probably a red flag. And we unfortunately have seen that a lot in the last 3 or 4 years.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to your last group of speakers.
We hope today's episode delivered actionable intelligence. We want to hear from the field. Share your questions or insights, leave a message on your favorite platform, or email us at editor@maadvisor.com. To secure your steady feed of premium M&A content, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and subscribe to our M&A Alerts email newsletter. Find the links in the description below or visit us directly at our website at www.maadvisor.com. I'm Roger Aguinaldo, founder and CEO of the M&A Advisor. Thank you for being part of the M&A Advisor community. Until next time, stay decisive, stay connected, and happy dealing.